This is Our Voices, Our Legacies, the Medical College of Wisconsin's Oral History Project. I'm Dick Katchke, MCW's Chief Historian. Following is an interview recorded July 26, 2016, with Dr. Jeffery Kelly, Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine and Director of MCW's federally designated Center for AIDS Intervention Research. Dr. Kelly is recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on behavior modification research for populations at high risk for HIV exposure. His research has been published in approximately 400 professional journals, and he has received more than $80 million in grant support, primarily from the National Institutes of Mental Health. Dr. Kelly has led or served on more than 60 national and international scientific committees studying AIDS prevention for the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Health Organization, and other scientific bodies. Dr. Kelly, let's start. What led to your interest in the field of psychology? Was this an interest you had even in high school, or did this start in college? When did this start?
It did not start early. It started when I was in college, and I was a major in four things. Probably English was really one, because I like to write. And I took a look at the job market at that time and said, well, I think graduate school is the path. And then I was drawn to psychology because it seemed a way to do something of social good. And that's how I went to the University of Kentucky and had plans of being a traditional psychologist. In fact, that's how my career started. I was directing an outpatient and family clinic at another institution, and was doing fine. And that was the mid-1980s. And a couple years before that, we started hearing about AIDS. We didn't even call it AIDS at that point. I think it was called gay-related infectious disease, GRID. And it was mysterious, but it was killing a lot of people, particularly on the East and West Coast. And over the next couple years, it became pretty clear that this was sexually transmitted. And then it became clear to myself and some colleagues that it would be a problem that might be dealt with through behavior change. Could we help alert people to the threat of AIDS? It was new then. It was still perceived as an unknown threat. And help people make changes to reduce their risk for contracting HIV infection, as we later knew it was. And so I moved out of my traditional psychology clinic and moved into HIV research in the mid-1980s. And this was when I was at a medical school in the Deep South, and that's where my career began. But it was also personally driven, because people I knew, generally that had gone to New York or San Francisco, came back to the South sick and died. And so that drove the point home. There was nobody else around me that was working in this area, and it seemed to me something important. And for the 30-some years since then, my career has been devoted almost entirely to HIV prevention research.
At the time that you started to do research, there wasn't a lot of other research that was being conducted. Were there others that were starting to look at behavior modification in the area of HIV prevention?
Well, it was a very different era. Unlike now, it was enormously pessimistic. People that contracted HIV died. Treatments were futile. There were treatments, but everyone knew they didn't work. Enormous stigma. In the 80s, it seems funny to think of now, but people really were afraid it would fly through the air, that you could get it through glasses and utensils and in bathrooms. And so it was an era of great stigma, great fear, and the government wasn't doing much. There was not much of a response to AIDS in those early days. In the scientific community, people were studying, but it was epidemiological body counting. How many people are getting it, how many people are dying, what kind of drugs did they use, that kind of thing. And my own temperament was always impatient. and it still is. And so I thought, rather than watching and counting and figuring out who's dying, we need to do something to change the trajectory. We have to develop interventions that would change the course of HIV. And that became my focus then, and it still is the focus of our center.
Well, now, when you look back, at the institution you were at and at other institutions, was the attitude one of support in terms of venturing into research on HIV, or was it, why are you bothering with this?
They were enormously embarrassed, enormously embarrassed. I would get grants from the National Institutes of Health, and the institution said, literally and directly, we're not going to announce these because we don't want to be known as an AIDS hospital. And they didn't. In the early days, I remember a state senator said in the state Senate, that our Dr. Kelly, he knows who these AIDS carriers are, and he's got their names, and we're going to get those so we can warn all the doctors and dentists and funeral homes and tell everybody who these carriers are. And I remember in my research, I would take all of our consent forms that people had signed. I took them home with me and kept them locked up in my home to protect them, the identity of people. There was a time when in our home, something was wrong with the front lawn. And it wasn't the green lawn, part of it was dying. And I realized somebody had spilled out AIDS and vegetation killer across the front lawn. So it was a pretty rough era. Not just stigma that so much affected people with this disease, but frankly stigma that affected anybody working on it, anybody researching it. And fortunately that's all radically different now, but it was a pretty scary era.
Well, at that time you made the decision then that perhaps you needed to work elsewhere. How did you come to MCW? How did MCW wind up on your radar screen?
It's an interesting story. I knew, I'm from the Midwest, so being in the Deep South that was not my natural environment anyway. And I knew I was going to be leaving, and that wasn't the right place to do this kind of research anyway. And I looked at a lot of jobs at medical schools primarily, and I looked at places that would be the places you'd expect in New York, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Those are the epicenters at that point. But none of them seemed quite right for me. They weren't my kind of cities. I'm a Midwestern guy. And I was in Milwaukee.
You're from the Cleveland area, if I
area.
remember correctly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Milwaukee for a meeting, and I'd always liked Milwaukee. My grandmother brought me here when I was 2 years old on the train from Cleveland. And it's always been a nice city. I was at the Milwaukee airport going back south. And I remember seeing a billboard, a lighted billboard thing inside of the airport, and it said Medical College of Wisconsin. And I thought, I knew about the University of Wisconsin. I'd heard of the Medical College of Wisconsin, but only vaguely. But I liked Milwaukee, and the Midwest sensibility seemed right. So I got back home, and the day after I got back home, I found out who the chair of psychiatry was. I was in the psychiatry department. And it was Dr. Harry Prevention. And this is the era when I typed and mailed a letter to Dr. Prevention, and I said, this is the kind of work I do, and I'm planning to leave where I am, and I wonder if it might be of any interest in Milwaukee and to your institution. And it was very fortuitous. I didn't know how. But right at that time, Dr. Prevention, Dr. Lennon, who was then president of the institution, Dr. Cooper, who was then the dean, were talking about increasing research at the institution, and in the psychiatry department there was none. And Dr. Prevention was charged with trying to increase research. Harry would always say, research is important, but research that does good for the community and that helps people who are marginalized is even better. And it fit the bill. I don't think AIDS was on anybody's list of priorities at that point for what the area should be, but it was very compatible with where the institution wanted to develop. And so I came here, I believe, 8 times. I think I didn't know until years later I exceeded the department's travel budget by a lot. Because even though I wasn't happy where I was, I don't like moving, and I really wanted to make sure the fit was right. And I came back after they offered me the position. I remember I came back and I told everybody all the bad things. I could tell them about what I do, that this is controversial. Remember, this is still the late 80s. That there'll be eyebrows raised. That our work is controversial too, because we're talking to people about how to change risky aspects of their behavior. My team will be diverse and will represent the communities in which we work and that we try to serve, and sort of all those kind of things that would have made an institution in the South nervous. And I remember Harry said, "Jeff, this is Milwaukee, it's not Mississippi," and it's all fine. It's all fine.
Now, who is it that you interviewed with? You met with Dr. Prosen. Did you meet with Drs. Lennon and Cooper as well?
I met with I believe Dr. Lennon was becoming ill at that point, and I met with Dr. Prosen, David Peterson, who was an administrator in the department, relatively new in that position, and I think what really attracted me here were those relationships, where I felt that they cared about what I did, not just the grant money, that they felt it was of social value, that they weren't concerned about potential controversy, that the public health value was important, and that they loved me rather than just love the grant money. I wanted to be somewhere where what I did and was important, not just how many NIH dollars I brought was important.
And at that point, your funding source was primarily the National Institutes of Mental Health, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, almost all of our funding has always been from National Institutes of Health institutes, and NIMH in particular.
And so you came to Milwaukee with grants, which is exciting. I can remember meeting with you shortly after you came, because this was big news. This was big that MCW had attracted a nationally respected researcher to work in the area of HIV prevention. After you came, you had to start building a team and assembling a team then as well.
I did.
Where did you recruit from?
Well, I did what people generally do. I went to people with whom I worked in the past and who I knew in the past, and I felt might be interested in an opportunity here, and brought. I also brought the people that worked with me in Mississippi. David Peterson, the administrator in psychiatry, had arranged for a moving van to pick up the key members of my team, all the household things, and moving everybody from the South to Milwaukee. And I don't know how people in Wisconsin felt when they saw so many Mississippi license plates, but it was an exciting time. So I brought the core of people.
And who were some of those people that you brought at the time?
Well, at the very beginning, people like Alan Hoth, Deborah Murphy, who since went on to UCLA and developed an outstanding career, Yvonne Stevenson, Michael Morgan, Dick Barr, the core people that did work with me in Mississippi came here.
When you first came to MCW, were there others within the institution that you started to develop working relationships with, or was yours such a unique program that it was sort of a one-off from everybody else's activities?
Well, there were people here that were doing fabulous things, and still are. Ernestine Willis, for example, was somebody who I met with right away. Pat McManus of the Black Health Coalition. We'd have lunch every couple weeks. My first year here, I think I did the right thing. I spent much of my first year meeting people, community members, heads of agencies and organizations and health departments and gay organizations and AIDS advocacy groups, and spent time just saying, what can we do that will help?
What was the reaction at that time on the part of community organizations? Was it one of, great, there's somebody here to partner with, or was it one of skepticism, are we just research subjects?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on how you approach it. If you say, we want to do research in your community or on you, or will you help us to do our research, people generally, they view research as important, but it's not their thing. Their thing is doing their programs, and very often people that I would meet with have been doing this for a long time with few resources, with very little recognition, and they've been on the front lines. And I found it important to say, we're not here to steal your thunder, and we're here to help, and we're not here to take over things that you're doing. And over the years, we maintained that kind of a view. So I think it requires sensitivity and community understanding in building bridges. And
now, your program was not located on the campus, and in fact, it's always been located away from MCW. What's the rationale? Why are you in the community rather than on the campus?
so all of our projects are not traditional hospital-based kinds of projects. We have to be accessible to the community, and particularly to people that aren't going to necessarily be able to find their way through the medical complex. It's too far. It's too hard. They don't want to be seen. And so we thought the best thing to do is be somewhere, and we've always been on the east side in Milwaukee, where people could take a bus to almost our front door, where people could come and go, where our signs don't say AIDS, and where we're a little bit understated and people are comfortable and they don't feel stigmatized. We have probably now 500 to 1,000 people from the community that come through our doors to participate in our studies every year. So we have to we're oriented to them, not to what's convenient for our investigators.
Now, when you came, one of the things that was interesting is that when people heard of HIV or AIDS, they automatically thought of the gay community. They thought of people that had been IV drug users. But there were some other audiences, some other populations that you also identified were at risk for HIV. And that was sort of an eye-opener. No one ever thought of those other populations, did they?
Many people did not. One of my quirks is I do all of my writing. Every paper, every grant, everything I've ever written professionally has been written on a legal pad with a pen, sitting in a coffee place somewhere. And this has been through my entire career. It still is. And years ago, probably in the late 90s, I was sitting in a McDonald's on North Avenue in Milwaukee late at night. I always write at night too. That's part of my routine. And I was looking around in this McDonald's at 10:30 at night, and I noticed I think everybody there was homeless or mentally ill, or both. And it was kind of funny because they were there hanging out. It was a cold night, and they wanted a place to stay. And they're looking at me sitting there with my legal pad and pencils writing for hours, and they're thinking, that guy looks pretty, this is pretty different. But as I was sitting there and it would get closer to closing time, I'd notice what people would do to find a place to stay. People connecting with other people because they didn't have a home to go to. And people would be kind of pairing up and leaving. And I thought, I bet sex is involved. I bet drugs are involved. I wonder what it would look like if you ever looked at HIV risk among people who were homeless and people who have serious mental illness. And we did. So from that, watching people in McDonald's one night, it led to doing some studies at our center to look at what is the risk for HIV among people that are young, homeless, with mental illness. And it was very high. very high. And that led to several grants and research studies that we did over subsequent years to develop intervention models to reach this kind of unexpected but vulnerable population.
Now, one of the things that you're known for is the Popular Leader program.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. This is a model that I developed, and it's been used by us and by lots of other people for a long time. If you go to a place, in our work, the places were gay bars in small cities. And if you were to sit and watch this 100 or 200 people that are in a bar, in a gay bar, and watch carefully, you would notice that some people are very popular. They're sort of sought out. Everybody says hello to them. They say hello. There's sort of clusters of people, and they're in the center. But a bar isn't just a bunch of, there are different segments of people in any kind of a place. Like there are younger people and there are older people. And there are dancers and there are people that watch the dancers. And there are sex workers that are in the parking lots. And there are lots of different segments. And those segments all have different key people that seem very popular and whose opinions matter. When people that are well-known and liked and trusted start saying something, other people pay attention. This is not a discovery I made. This was made a long time earlier in a very different context, but we thought it applies to HIV prevention too. If you're trying to get the word out about anything important in HIV prevention, wouldn't it be a good idea to get these key opinion leaders on board, help them to understand what the issues are, and help them become agents of change so they could change the knowledge and the headset and the attitudes and the norms of everybody else. And over 2 decades of research, we applied this model to HIV prevention with gay men, but also with women who live in inner city housing developments and kids that live in low-income housing. And any kind of population, there are always these key people. So we would, most HIV prevention had always been counseling people about what's wrong about their behavior and why they got to change. And that's kind of a negative thing. People generally don't want to hear that. People would rather be thought of as a part of the solution than to be called the problem. And so the model, we'd find opinion leaders and would say, you know, we have watched and we've talked to people, and you're one of the best liked people around here. Everybody knows you, and people really trust you. You're in a position to save your friends' lives. Would you like to know more about how? And people don't say no to that kind of an invitation because you're appealing to what they can do, and they become the solution, not the problem. And plus, they can do this a lot better than any scientific investigator can because they know their friends. So we've published a lot of studies that have shown that this kind of a model can bring down the risk temperature in a community. But you know, the field of HIV, has changed for the better. Much of what I've been saying were the old days of HIV. The field changed dramatically really in 1996 when new classes of medications became available. They called them combination therapies, they called them drug cocktails or different names that became able to really suppress HIV infection. And when those medications became available, HIV stopped being an invariably fatal disease. Treatments were no longer futile. And what we've seen since then is that people that are diagnosed early, that engage in care, that have suppressed viral load, their life expectancy is about the same as everybody else's. It's not terribly different. This is a huge game changer. I remember in the days when if you looked at a gay newspaper, it was 12 pages of obituaries of 30-year-olds. It's not true anymore, not true anymore. Some people are still not being reached. That's a different challenge. But the potential there is there for long, healthy lives for people with HIV. It's not a death sentence. There was another development that happened a few years later, which is finding that people that are at high risk for HIV could take an antiretroviral pill every day, different than the treatment drugs, but an antiretroviral pill. And if they did this, their risk of contracting HIV was 95% less than if they don't. So we have now the keys to eradicating AIDS in Milwaukee, in the state, the country, and the world. We know what to do. We need to get people diagnosed early and into care and help them adhere to it. We need to find people that are very likely to contract HIV otherwise and get them started taking pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's called PrEP. And that, coupled with using your good judgment, could stop HIV and make it something of the past. That's where our research agenda now is. And we're doing this locally, nationally, and at a worldwide level.
Now, back in the 90s, MCW was designated as a Center for AIDS Intervention Research. It was a federally designated center from the NIMH. Mm-hmm. And if I recall correctly, we were one of only 5 or 6 centers, and the only one between New York and California.
And we still are.
And we still
are.
So with that in mind, what makes this center different than the centers you'd find in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things. One of them is we're in a different part of the country. The country's 3,000 miles wide, and all the other centers are on the east and west coast. It sounds like about 2,800 miles wide of the country. That's probably more like Milwaukee than the east or the west coast. So the models and the approaches and the findings that we uncover here are applicable to many, many other places in the country. Most of the country isn't like San Francisco and New York. So that's part. Another part is what I described as impatience. We're the center that said at the very beginning, our job is going to be to change the course of an epidemic. We're going to do interventions. We're going to try things. Some of them will work, some of them won't work. But we're not going to just sit at the sidelines and count how many people are dying. And that made us a different kind of center. And I think the other issues, Milwaukee has every bad social problem that any city has. But Milwaukee also is the kind of city where you can pull together people from agencies, organizations, and communities and say, let's have a meeting together and see if we can find some ways to work on this. And you can do it. Can't do that in New York. So I think that there are opportunities here that are really unique, and we're blessed with a great city health department, a fabulous AIDS program in our state health department, and there's kind of a Midwestern cooperativeness that's unique.
Now you talked about how Milwaukee represents more of the nation than perhaps the coast would, and with that respect, you also launched a program at one point too, where you were looking at risk behaviors in smaller urban areas, places like La Crosse or Boise, Idaho. That's unique. People wouldn't think of HIV in those communities, but HIV exists there, I understand.
It's we've always thought of big cities being hard hit by AIDS. We thought of that in the 80s. We think of it now, and it's true. It's true. But if you look at all the other cities in the country, think of the Milwaukee and Cleveland and Detroit and Cincinnati and St. Louis and all those kind of pretty big cities. And then we think of smaller towns. We think of the Superiors and the Wausau's and the Green Bays. that actually accounts for the majority of infections in the country. So we're a center that has a vision that just isn't a single urban area. We're also a center that has a worldview. Until the late 90s, all of CARE's research was domestic. It would go on in different cities in different parts of the country, but within the United States. And it occurred to myself and colleagues that 96% of HIV in the world is not in North America. How can you be a center that says we want to change the course of an epidemic and not be working somewhere else as well internationally? And at that point we developed an international portfolio, chiefly focused on former Soviet Union countries of the
And
former
why?
Because I was talking with colleagues and they said, Jeff, why aren't you doing stuff in sub-Saharan Africa where HIV burden is horrible, but also where there are hundreds and hundreds of researchers that are working on it? And I thought, it's important, it's critically important, but it's crowded. Lots of other people are working there. And then someone mentioned Russia and the Soviet Union. And it was not crowded. And we did some investigation and realized this region is on the brink of a huge catastrophe. They don't know it, and there's nobody doing anything. And that kind of, again, appealed to that part of me that wants to do something that other people aren't. In Russia, there were 1,000 people had been diagnosed with HIV until 1996, 1,000 in the whole country. They tested everybody, so they weren't missing anybody. That number is now 1.3 million. It's the fastest rise in the world.
Is it a different demographic than you would find in the United States?
It is. It was driven in part because in the Soviet era, the Soviets always said, well, AIDS isn't going to be a problem here because nobody has any freedoms. And actually it was true. But then the Soviet Union fell apart, and suddenly it was chaos. And the chaos showed up in different ways, but one of which was wide-scale drug use, where you'd have 14-year-old kids injecting drugs, and just massive, an antiquated public health infrastructure from the Soviet era that couldn't possibly handle this kind of thing. And so it exploded really out of nowhere. And that's where we chose to work. We've been funded by NIH for 17 years now for our projects in the post-Soviet region, Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Hungary. Other of my colleagues are working in Latin America and are carrying out projects there. So we about 40% of our work now is outside the United States.
And one of the things I believe you found when you were in Romania is the Roma population was at higher risk than some other populations then as well, right?
Yes. In Bulgaria particularly, Roma are, some people call them the gypsies, migrated from India to Eastern Europe, particularly a long time ago, and stand apart is a minority. Roma are different in appearance, different in culture, and the circumstances of Roma are terrible. Someone described it as being African American in the U.S. in the 50s, but a lot worse. Unemployment is something like 90%. One Roma graduated from a university in Bulgaria last year. Just deplorable conditions, but also very segregated. So Roma communities are geographically, often they're geographically walled to separate them from the majority community. People live in metal shacks that are every bit as bad as any slum I've ever seen anywhere. So that's a community that we also chose to focus on, again, because massive needs and underserved.
Now, you were entering a part of the world, Eastern Europe, that perhaps was not as receptive to HIV, to people with HIV, to research on HIV. Did you find that perhaps in some respects you were dealing with some of the same problems that you had in the 1980s in the United States?
Yes, yes. You can't stereotype an entire region, and also over time there have been changes. There was a lot of optimism at the end of the Soviet era that there would be freedom through that region, and it hasn't exactly panned out that way.
Now, if I remember correctly, your funding, in addition to the National Institutes of Mental Health, was also supported by the World Health Organization, and you were receiving support from WHO?
We have, and we've received support from Pasteur Institute. Now, we're actually, for some of our initiatives in Russia, we're receiving support on the U.S. side from the National Institutes of Health, and also from the Russian version of the NIH, their own version, for international bilateral collaboration. Even though things are a little difficult politically, I think there still remains the feeling that you've got to keep scientific collaborations and health collaborations working, even when political leaders disagree.
That's fascinating. Now, one of the other things I recall is that you had a frustration in that the scientific community was exposed to the research findings on behavior modification, but there was a concern on how do we get that information in the hands of the people that need it, that need to work with. How did you approach that?
This is a really critical issue. If you're in an academic, a traditional academic environment, you get credit for publishing articles in journals. And you get really good credit if they're good articles in really good journals. But journals are read by other scientists. Very often, people on the front lines in any area, especially HIV and AIDS, don't have access to those journals. If they did, they wouldn't be able to carry out programs based on the findings of those articles. In many parts of the world, they don't read the language that those articles are published in. So we, I think, often have a system where in the scientific arena, we talk to other scientists, and the scientists learn a lot. But when you think about what is our work really meant to do, it's meant to directly help people and help providers who are on the front lines. In AIDS, it's a very stark example where the providers, the AIDS organizations in Uzbekistan, aren't going to read any article that we publish in the Lancet. It just won't happen. So we, over about 15 years, also became a center that said we want to scientifically study how to move our findings directly into the hands of providers. And we began this in the United States, working with AIDS organizations in every state, so that we could share with them how to use our research findings. Not just what are the findings, but how do you transform those into programs that may be more effective than what is being done right now. We then got more ambitious and said, we've done this in the country, let's try the world. And we enrolled AIDS organizations from 88 countries in the world. It was quite a challenge to find the leading AIDS frontline organization in the capital or the largest city of 88 countries, but we did. And we then brought people together. That was quite a logistic challenge, and said we'd like to be a conduit, and we'd like to give you information and training in how to carry out evidence-based programs in your community. But we said something else. We said, we know quite a lot about evidence-based programs. You know far, far more than us about your communities and what's going to work and how it has to be tailored and adapted so it fits right culturally. Can't be the Western researchers come and tell you what to do. We can share, but this has to be driven by our scientific knowledge and your community knowledge put together in the right way. So we did this project. We had AIDS organizations from all over Africa, all over Eastern Europe and post-Soviet countries and Central Asia, from Latin America, the Caribbean, and quite a number of countries and organizations and languages. So, how we talk, the language we speak when we're talking to French, Francophile countries in Africa versus Russian-speaking countries in Eastern Europe versus Spanish-speaking countries. So we developed teams at CARE. And the teams always involved somebody who knew a lot about the interventions and somebody who knew lots about the culture and could speak the language and understood. And we would form teams that would communicate through distance technologies with the AIDS organizations throughout the world as they considered how our findings might be helpful to them. We weren't trying to tell them this is what you need to do. We were trying to say these are things you might consider and take what of this that you think fits for you.
Now, one of the projects that you've been involved in for the past few years has been focused on a very difficult community to reach, and that's the African American community of men who have sex with men, which is very difficult to identify, if I understand correctly.
It is. Some people are hidden in the community because they want to be, and for a lot of reasons aren't going to come forward and say, I'd like to be in an HIV prevention, anything. It's stigmatized. In communities, homosexuality is stigmatized, and people are often wanting to stay hidden and in the background, but that doesn't mean without a lot of risk. We know that in the United States, African American men who have sex with men are far disproportionately likely to contract HIV infection, not because of more frequent risk behavior, but actually because prevalence has become so high that it's simply very likely that a person who is sexually active is going to encounter an infected partner, often somebody not in care, not with suppressed viral load, and they're going to contract HIV. So we have found, a little bit like our opinion leader model, my colleague Yuri Amirhanian really developed this model. People can be reached through their connections with other people. And so in the U.S. and with African American men who have sex with men, we find someone and say, we need to gain their trust. And we say, can you tell your friends about this program? And we'll keep everybody's name confidential. And they know their friends. When their friends come, they know other people, and we're able to reach into a community by means of network connections among people. That helps us reach people that we could never find otherwise because they're known, but only to their own friends. This model operates on trust. It won't work unless people really trust you, but if you make that investment, we find it is possible to.
Now, you are housed in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine, but the work that you're doing has implications at MCW for infectious disease, epidemiology, public health, global health. How do you and your team interact with others in other academic disciplines here at MCW?
In the past, I think people felt that AIDS was kind of a niche. It was its own thing. It was a sidecar of some type, not particularly related to other issues. And it's not true. That's not true. The more we learn, the more we see social health problems that are interconnected. HIV is linked to other things related to reproductive health, to teenage, adolescent medicine, to substance abuse, to homelessness and disadvantage, to a wide range of other problems. And we find it's enormously important to have a perspective where you're dealing not just with HIV in isolation, but in fact related, correlated problems. I think that's the wave of the future. I think that's where this field is going to go, dealing with things that are related in people's lives.
Obviously, you've been tremendously successful in the program that you've developed and grown here at MCW. Who are some of the people that you've worked with, both at MCW and in the community, that help contribute to the success?
We have been enormously fortunate over the time I've been here to bring many people, generally new in the field, who have developed their research and their careers with us at CARE. In fact, maybe that's my greatest joy, is looking back. And people since I came, Deborah Murphy, who was with us, did a great job, went to UCLA. Seth Kalishman, now a noted person in the field, and he's at the University of Connecticut after being here and developed his career. David Holtgrave at Johns Hopkins, a department chair, the leading expert in cost effectiveness in HIV, was with us earlier on. Cheryl Gore-Felton was with us for a number of years, did great, went to Stanford. So we've got lots of people who have generally come here new and who have found the environment and the institutional support so terrific for their career development. That's my joy. My frustration is the same thing. That when you develop people, now we have had people whose careers developed who stayed, but very often for different reasons. People, Milwaukee, I would never want to live anywhere else, but other people sometimes do. And that when someone does become successful, they become attractive to big institutions on the East and West Coast particularly, and that's where people have gone. So that's my my joy and my challenge in my career is helping new people develop. And we have people now that are going to follow the same trajectories in the future. We'd like to have more of them stay here.
Tell us about the Jeff Kelly rule at the National Institutes of Mental Health.
This was from several years ago when we were very fortunate. Because of the great people that we have, we were able to put in a number of applications that were very well regarded and that were becoming funded. To the point that one of our funding agencies said, there are too many grants, and they invoked they called it I didn't think it was funny, they called it the Jeff Kelly rule, which is a limit as to the number of grants that anyone can have. And those were, in fact, the good old days.
Well, now, you talked about writing your grants on a pad of paper at the McDonald's. You also talked about early on having an interest in writing. And do you find that by being a good writer, you have been more successful, perhaps, than some others in being able to receive grants?
I have. Again, it's maybe a little idiosyncratic to me. I like to approach writing a research grant like somebody else might approach writing a novel. I like to develop a plot line. I like to sketch out the plot. I like to think about the theme. I like to build drama. I like to leave somebody thinking, we really have to do this because it's going to be awful if we don't. So you want to get people on board. So I find the writing to be maybe a little less scientific and a little bit more creative, and really being clear about why this is important, and building up plot, tension, drama, and hopefully outcome. And I find that, so I think that's the link. I may be as much a writer, and maybe my original major in English is in fact what's playing out here.
Now, as you look to the future, obviously we've seen some tremendous advances in HIV, and what was once a very dismal future is no longer. What do you see in terms of some of the next challenges and opportunities you'll have in the behavior modification work that you're doing, as you look ahead?
Well, the dismal picture is no longer. That all depends. Right? It potentially could be dismal no longer, but that really rests on people who contract HIV, knowing it early and getting into care, staying in care. It really depends on people that are at high risk who might be taking a PrEP regimen to protect themselves, really knowing it and getting that care. We find that these things work well in clinical trials. They work very well. But making something that works in a clinical trial work in the world is a different kind of problem. So we're thinking more and more about what some people call implementation science. How do you take findings and approaches that you know can work and implement them in the world? And then how do you help them reach the people they most need to reach? You mentioned before African American men who have sex with men. In the United States, clearly the population segment we most need to reach, but we often reach the least right now. So how do we develop ways to alert people to why to get tested regularly, what to do if you're positive, why not to think about this as a death sentence, but more a chance to live a long, long, healthy, happy life. We have to be able to take these advances and make them work in the field. We have to do it here in Milwaukee. But we also have to do it every place else in the country and the world. And when we do that, we will have eradicated AIDS. People sometimes say, well, you know, you've been doing this so long, what would you do if you really did? If HIV didn't completely go away, it becomes a pretty minor issue. We would be so happy. And then we would take all the models that we've used in HIV and find other things to apply them to, whether they're violence or teen pregnancy or substance abuse or other kinds of health problems. And that would be a happy day indeed.
So you've got an infrastructure that can really be used for anything.
We think so.
And so, now, we talked earlier, Dr. Harry Prosen was the person that helped recruit you, helped bring you here, helped really give you the support that you needed to launch your program. And he's still a part of your program, isn't he?
He is. He was chair of psychiatry and then retired. But we weren't going to let him get away too much. So even though retired and a professor emeritus, he has an office at our place and is there pretty much every week and shares his kind of calming social perception, just his incredibly warm style. I think I told you earlier I was looking at a number of positions, and Harry was somebody who I could just tell his word was gold. I just knew it, and it was. So I've known him since before I came here, and he and David Peterson and others have been supportive, and so has the institution's leadership. So I've been here long enough that there have been several deans and several presidents, and even though everyone's different, the commitment of MCW to what we do has been steadfast. It's been steadfast. People haven't been nervous. They've been hugely supportive. Sometimes we're so well-funded that they invoke the Jeffery Kelly rule at NIH, but sometimes we're not. And the institution understands that, and it's been that way. You, Dick, I remember when I came here, you said to me one time, very early on, if you ever get media calls and a reporter, somebody wants to talk with you, talk to them and tell them whatever you want to tell them. I don't have to be there. We're not going to tell you what to say. We'll support you. And that kind of thing mattered so much because it conveyed an acceptance and a trust that I valued hugely.
Thank you. We've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything I've forgotten to ask you that you'd like to make sure that we add?
I think we've covered a lot of territory.
Great.
And I hope this has been
This is exactly what we've wanted.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sure. Thank you.
I appreciate it.